Welcome to Incredible Idaho. I'm Wayne Walker. Tonight we begin our show with a story about the dynamic science of forensics. Now, many of the blood testing methods that are making today's courtroom headlines are the same techniques the Idaho Department of Fish and Game uses to investigate wildlife crimes. Often, the conviction of a poacher may depend on what comes out of a test tube. A typical scenario may begin with a Fish and Game conservation officer following up on a tip phoned in by a witness. Let's say a citizen called Officer Bob Sellers to report that he had seen someone shoot a deer out of season. Bob's first step would be to visit the scene of the alleged crime to search for evidence of an illegal kill.
Okay, it looks like we've got some blood here laid out by an animal that was wounded, passed through the area. So what we want to do is collect as much as we can to allow the lab to be able to analyze it to determine what type of blood, like deer or elk, and just to get as much information as we can.
If the blood proves to be from a deer or elk, Bob can rule out other sources such as human blood from a hunter injury, and it will give him another facet of evidence in court to back up the statement from the eyewitness.
It's very important without the lab to back up the evidence that we find out in the field. Some of the cases that we were able to detect and determine a violator, we wouldn't be able to prove in court. It's just another nail in the coffin of the violator.
The evidence is labeled and hand-carried to the Fish and Game Wildlife Health Laboratory near Caldwell. Lab biologist Sharon Landon's first task on receiving the evidence is to sort through the mud and debris.
You want to remove anything that's not related to the case, that's just going to, confuse the issue. So usually I try to pick out something that has a great deal of blood on it, such as this piece here. And then eventually what I'll end up doing is pooling all of these samples to get a real good example to run the tests on.
Sharon is very meticulous in her handling of the evidence, documenting every step. This will help her to remember the details of each case if she were to be called to testify in court. It's a job that requires a lot of patience and precision and constant updating on the astounding new developments in the field of forensics. But for Sharon, that's a gratifying aspect of the work and part of the challenge.
It's an exciting sense of doing tests and doing forensics, because basically forensics was started more seriously towards wildlife in the 80s, and there's looking more and more towards it to go to trials and this type of thing. So a lot of the things that they're using in human medicine or with the sheriffs and the police are now being transferred over into what can be done with wildlife.
A small amount of distilled water is added to each sample, rehydrating the dried blood that has soaked into the leaves.
Okay, and then you could see on this one, this is a pretty good sample, because if I was to pull the leaves away a little bit from there, you can see what liquid it is, and it is the color of the blood.
This sample then travels down the hall to be placed into a centrifuge that will further separate the liquid from the leaves and debris, leaving a more concentrated sample for Sharon to work with.
As you can see, the leaves and all the dirt is compacted down to the bottom, which allows us to be able to suck off the portion that looks the red stain portion of the liquid.
Sharon has a plate prepared that contains what's called an antisera in one of these tiny wells. A small droplet of our sample is then placed next to it in one of the remaining wells.
Tomorrow we'll read the plates, and in fact I read it 24 hours and 48 hours just to make sure. And I'll read the plate to see if there's any reaction between your sample and what I've put down, that it will be able to identify whether this is in this particular case, it would be the deer family.
But this is just one example of the forensics work performed in the Fish and Game Health Lab. Often, Sharon will get a request from an officer to identify a species from some hairs found in the bed of a pickup. This is a mule deer hair, magnified under the microscope.
They bring a variety of things, and it's just unreal what they can bring, but it all pertains to the scene of what happened there and what they think would prove whatever they're trying to prove.
Feathers may also be turned into the lab for identification. By comparing it to the lab's collection, Sharon concludes that this one appears to be a tail feather from a red-tailed hawk. If she needs further verification, the feather too will end up under the microscope.
Which will show to you
X-rays like this one of a trumpeter swan can confirm whether or not an animal has died from a gunshot wound, and can also help Sharon locate the pieces of shot in the body cavity that may need to be extracted for ballistic tests.
These white spots here are where there's metal that the X-ray is not going through, and then over here you can even see the fracture of the bone. So the wing was actually broken as well as being shot in the shoulder portion.
Trumpeter swans are a protected species, so this data could prove very valuable to the arresting officer. But whatever the evidence, the challenge for Sharon is to always keep an open mind and to question everything.
I think anybody who gets into the science area has some interest in answering questions in their own mind as to why things happen or the what-ifs in the world. And doing forensic is more like doing it's like mini mysteries in which a case comes in and you have to take each piece and put it together to see if it fits into the story or into the setting or whatever.
These deer at this particular site, there's a couple of them in there that look kind of ragged, but most of them look like they're in real good shape. They look just fine.
A Rocky Mountain winter can be pretty tough on Idaho's wildlife populations. Often, feeding our deer, elk, and antelope seems the logical thing to do when the animals look hungry. But is it in the best interests of the wildlife of our state?
One of the other problems with winter feeding is it basically takes the wild out of wildlife. And a lot of people don't like the idea of animals not living on native range and being subjected to the normal kinds of pressures that are put on Mother Nature puts on wildlife populations. That keeps them healthy, reduces the chances of disease becoming a problem in the herd, etc.
Each winter, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game wrestles with the decision of when and where to feed our state's wildlife. Sometimes the decision is easy. For example, one of the most common emergency conditions that may trigger a feeding operation is a depredation problem, a situation where wild animals are eating feed reserved for livestock. It could be an area like this near Garden Valley. Although the winter has been fairly mild, the deer and elk will still seek out an easy lunch, feeding shoulder to shoulder with this landowner's cattle. Fish and Game may authorize feeding in the area in order to draw the wild animals away from the domestic ones. Problems are also becoming common in areas like the Boise foothills. The encroachment of subdivisions on deer and elk wintering range forces wildlife into close contact with people, and this can cause conflict.
It's very frustrating, yeah, because we don't like to see the animals bothering people and damaging property, but by the same token, we've got some marvelous winter range here, and there are many animals wintering in this area that are wintering away from people on this kind of vegetation and doing just fine. But the ones that come here end up having to be fed because they're attracted into the subdivision, they cause damage, and there's no other way to solve the problem.
The attraction is the landscaping, the ornamental shrubs and trees that have been watered and fertilized all summer long. These are irresistible to deer and elk. But feeding the wildlife isn't always the best solution because it teaches them to return to this same spot year after year. And if more subdivisions are built in the winter range, the problem may become overwhelming.
And in the long run, what we're concerned about is that we can deal with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these, but 15 or 20 or 30 we can't. And what it eventually means in the long term is we're going to have fewer deer and elk. The only real way to deal with this problem is to reduce the populations. And of course, that's something that we're not excited about doing. And so the easiest way to solve this is to
is to not build in winter ranges where it can possibly be avoided.
Another emergency condition that may prompt a feeding operation is an area like this, where deer and elk are crossing highways, causing a public safety hazard. The animals are fed further up on the hillsides to try and entice them away from roads and vehicles.
The other situation is where we have a true biological emergency, where the animals are in poor condition, the snows are too deep to restrict their movement, cover up their food supply, and we have no choice but to feed them to prevent mortality.
All right, we're ready.
Each afternoon since the beginning of January, these volunteers have been loading up a pickup with 50-pound bags of deer and elk pellets. This area around Lohman is still recovering from the fire that swept through in 1989. Although the shrubs and grasses are making a strong comeback, our early snows quickly buried the young plants, making it difficult for deer and elk to find nourishing food. When temperatures began to plummet around the holidays, the decision was made to begin feeding, and longtime Lohman resident Bill Judy answered the call. He has helped with emergency feeding for over 30 years and says that the chance to watch wildlife is reward enough.
Oh, it is. That's the reason I don't mind doing it at all. Just, there's not too many people in the world that you get the opportunity to have wild game come up to, what, 25 feet away from us?
The deer look healthy, and the milder weather has diminished the snowpack considerably. As a result, the amount of feed has been cut back. But the original decision to begin the operation was a sound one.
We use a variety of criteria to try to help us make that decision: the depth of the snow, the temperature, the time of the year, the extent of the migration, and the condition of the animals. What do they look like? Are they looking angular and skinny, or do they look rounded and still in pretty good shape? And their behavior, do they walk around, are they fairly frisky, or are they dragging themselves around? And it's always a difficult call.
The reluctance to commit to a feeding situation is partly due to economics, but more importantly, artificial gathering of large numbers of wild animals in an area can be an invitation for disease.
With elk particularly, the disease brucellosis is a real bane to the livestock industry. They can't deal with it. It has a serious impact on the livestock industry. It can also affect the elk population. So you want to avoid that at all costs. And it is a very real possibility. At every feed ground in Wyoming, they have 23 elk feed grounds. They have brucellosis in every one of them. And we don't want that in Idaho.
Wyoming has been feeding their elk every winter since the early 1900s. They come to the feed grounds for handouts as they have for generations, and each winter the concentration of wild animals spreads disease. We've avoided that trap here in Idaho, and so far both our elk and domestic cattle have remained free of the disease brucellosis. If we can keep to the policy of winter feeding only in a real emergency situation, not only will our animals stay healthy, but we'll have a wildlife population that is truly wild.
Scat, right? Scat is something that a lot of people don't usually like to talk about, but it's one of my favorite subjects. And we're going to be talking about that here in a little bit.
In our next story, we're going to introduce you to a rather unusual wildlife instructor. Now, her resume probably reads something like this: has a great rapport with kids, recognizes more than 25 Idaho species by their droppings, and can walk like a toad.
So it just walks on its toes. Then it'll swivel, and it just walks like this.
Meet Professor Scat'n'tracks. Actually, her real name is Adair Evans, but to these 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, she's a bit of a legend, a wildlife tracker with the skills of a modern-day Daniel Boone.
Otters also have that little smell about them.
She easily captures the attention of these students at Hope Lutheran School in Idaho Falls. But attention is something she's been accustomed to as she journeys across the width and breadth of Idaho, driving an old van full of taxidermy animals. Well, Most likely, those animals are on their way to a presentation at one of Idaho's 700 schools. Adair Evans heads up Project Nose to Nose, an educational program sponsored by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game in cooperation with the Bureau of Land Management.
It's pretty heavy, so you might want to get towards this end. There you go.
Last year, over 8,000 Idaho school children went nose to nose with badgers, bobcats, and bats. The idea is to present wildlife and natural resource topics in a manner that challenges the children to think like a scientist.
So what we need to do to learn about animals is look for the clues that they leave for us to find. Now, animals leave all kinds of clues for us to find. What's one clue that an animal might leave for us? Droppings, scat. Yeah, and actually scat is one of the best clues that you have to figure out what an animal obviously has been eating. Maybe if it's sick, if it's healthy. Where has it been? Do you think by looking at scat we can figure out part of an animal's habitat?
Along with the taxidermy mounts, Adair's presentation includes plaster casts made from wild animal tracks, ranging from coyote and elk to geese and toads. The students learn how to group the footprints into families and then, yeah, you guessed it, how to identify the scat that corresponds to each track.
Bears will eat so many berries their scat will turn blue.
Adair goes on to explain how a bear's diet changes with the season of the year and the habitat, all of which can be read in the animal's scat. It's a science lesson built around childhood's favorite pursuits: camping, hiking, and spending time in the outdoors.
I've always been real interested in animal tracks and what you can kind of learn about animals without really seeing them and all the clues that are kind of left out there. So I just thought, well, if I'm interested in it, maybe the kids will be too. And so that's where a lot of my ideas kind of come from, things that I'm kind of interested in.
But the best part of the whole lesson is when Professor Scat'n'tracks says these magic words.
Why don't you come on up and have a look?
The students are allowed to touch most of the animals, to literally go nose to nose with predators and prey, whose relationship, by the way, fascinates this future scientist.
I learned that the wolverine stayed away from people. I thought it would attack them if they came on the territory. I learned that porcupines actually had hair. It was very interesting. I learned that you collected scat.
It's quite obvious that 9-year-old Beth Stoops found the whole presentation intriguing, but then it seems that she's a wildlife biologist at heart.
I love great horned owls. In fact, I love all types of birds, even eagles. I think it's very interesting that you guys come around and teach people about this. I think it's really nice.
I think the most rewarding thing about my job is just watching the kids. When you're giving a talk and all of a sudden you see a kid out there whose eyes just kind of light up and you realize all of a sudden they get it. And they'll start asking questions about some things. They'll want to know more than you told them. And that's really the fun part, is kind of realizing that, yeah, I actually did sort of touch that child.
The first question from the smaller children is whether or not the animals are real.
Now, do you think their eyes are real? No. That's right, they're glass. What about the claws on the animals? Are they real? Yes, they are.
This presentation for kindergarten through 3rd grade is called Animal Inns.
And so you can think of a dead tree like this one as really an inn for an animal. It's a place where they can sleep, and it's also a place where they can find some food that they might need.
The students learn about the food chain, about the need for shelter, and the reason why a cold-blooded animal like a turtle is inclined to sit on a log in the sun. But like a true researcher, this little girl questions the conventional explanation.
The reason why I think turtles don't get sweaty is because they're slow.
That might be one reason why. She said, I think the reason the turtles don't get sweaty is because they're just slow. Well, that might be a reason why, too. They don't move very fast, do they? It's amazing what kids will ask. I've had some questions where I just had to say, I don't know, because they'll come up with some of the strangest things.
I've seen holes in trees in Yellowstone.
You have seen holes in trees in Yellowstone? What kind of animals do you think might have lived in those holes?
A chipmunk.
A chipmunk?
Well, they're really excited about being able to touch things that they are not used to seeing. Of course, the bigger animals, the wolverine and the badger and the bear, they were very interested in. They loved animals.
Okay, what was your favorite animal up here?
The owl.
How come?
Because I like their claws.
What do you think they do with those?
Pick up their food with it.
What do you think about dead trees?
They're neat. I like to climb them.
Pick me up and
For Adair Evans, soon to be a parent herself this summer, the reward comes in helping to mold a new generation of good stewards, young citizens who will grow up to be capable caretakers of our planet. Here at Hope Lutheran School, it looks as though the message has been well received. That's it for tonight. Thanks for being with us. As we close our show, we'll take you back to the mountains along the snowy shores of the Payette River.